All right, friends. A few weeks ago, we had a similar class where we read some articles from the week's news and then discussed them. I've picked out 3 articles. I'm not sure we'll have time to get to 3 articles, but we're going to start by reading this first article, which is sort of a memoir of sorts. And I'm wondering if I can get 2 volunteers to read it. The first volunteer to read the front page and the first 4 paragraphs halfway through, stopping with the pecan pie to seal the deal. Who would read the first page through the pecan pie to seal the deal? Would somebody read that for us, pretty please? Jeffrey, would you read that for us? Thank you so much. And hold on. Who would read the second half? Who would pick up after the pecan pie and read the rest of the article? Who might read that part for us? Thank you so much, Rhonda. All right, 1, 2, here we go.
The dementia heist. We had to trick my mother into memory care center. The doctors called it therapeutic lying. Hiding with my older sister in her SUV, I'm nauseated. We're committing a heinous crime. 20 feet away, I see a paramedic escort my silver-haired mother into the memory care center, a nursing home for patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. We tricked Mom into coming here because she's not safe living alone. Moments before, we set up her room with photos and labeled her clothing. Nurses recommended we stay out of sight. I feel like the worst daughter. But according to the doctors and social workers, we were doing the most caring thing. Even as a child, my relationship with my mother was volatile. I constantly navigated her unpredictable emotions. To encourage positivity, I complimented her cooking, dressed like her mini-me, and parroted her disdain for our unassimilated Russian relatives. Good moods meant she'd share apple slices over a Doris Day movie, fry me blueberry blintzes, or help me fashion opera gloves from bubble bath while sitting next to me in the tub. Bad moods meant an endless cycle of slaps, me prostrating myself, and her forgiving. I always knew that my mother had a hard life. As a girl in Russia, she watched her father bleed out after Nazis bombed a local railway station. At 27, she fell from a train, shattering her kneecap and almost dying from gangrene. She dreamed of becoming a singer, but instead married my father, an old bachelor and the only man who'd marry a cripple, my grandma said. In 1964, they abandoned everything with little money to immigrate to the United States. Although I understood the source of my mother's bitterness and inflexibility, our difficulties persisted. As an adult, I moved 1,700 miles away and visited annually to limit strife. Unlike my sister, who understood that peace required diplomacy, I stood my ground, hoping it would yield my mother's respect. On one visit, we saw La La Land, and I refused to agree with her that the film was boring. My mother threatened permanent silence, declaring that I was no longer her daughter. I countered by waiting weeks to call. I fantasized that someday we'd stop fighting and have a closer relationship. But then came the dementia. My sister, who lived nearby, kept me updated. First, my mother forgot the word dog. Then, she got lost on the way home from the grocery store. There were hallucinations of flashing lights at 2 a.m. and strangers in her bedroom. Eventually, Mom, a talented cook, stopped eating and dropped 20 pounds in a month. Her refrigerator was bare except for a wall of empty butter boxes she'd taped shut. 2 doctors diagnosed dementia and recommended 24-hour care, which she rejected. She'd fallen several times, couldn't write a check or drive. My sister silently drove her to physicians, paid bills, bought groceries, and took the blame for my mother's deteriorating mind. Then, Mom called the police on her new caregiver, a gentle Polish woman who she claimed broke into her apartment. My sister worked hard to enable her to stay home, but she was constantly getting demanding and confused telephone calls from Mom during her workday. She couldn't juggle my mother's multiplying needs with her family. Our choices were to let her die alone from starvation or trick her into memory care. Days later, my sister and I toured memory care centers. One smelled of urine and industrial cleaner with wheelchair-bound despondent seniors. At $100,000 a year, it was one of the nicer places. They sent us home with pecan pie to seal the deal.
We found a better facility with a B&B vibe and patient staff members who gave lots of hugs. My sister signed a 40-page contract making her liable if Mom injured another resident or destroyed property. We negotiated her level of care because bathing assistants bumped up the monthly price by $1,000. It felt like buying a car instead of caring for the woman who spoon-fed me chicken soup when I was sick. Next, we needed to get my mother into the center. We had her admitted to the hospital, blaming her high blood pressure. Then we said the doctor wanted her to go to physical rehab. Professionals call it therapeutic lying because honesty can increase dementia patients' anxiety. In the hospital, I tried to feed her a bite of babka, but she had time traveled to the Battle of Kursk. She was 14 years old, crouching behind a bush as a German fighter pilot gunned down fleeing children. It was frightening, but affirmed our conviction that this move was necessary. Once she was in memory care, we couldn't contact her for an agonizing 10 days to help her adapt. But we got reports. Mom wouldn't sleep in her room, parking herself in the lobby all night. She refused to eat. We worried that if she kept starving herself, she'd be sent to a more depressing, regular nursing home. Then she refused medication, claiming the pills were making her lose her memory. The staff hid meds in her food, but she resisted her glaucoma drops, risking blindness. When I visited, she was belligerent, insisting I take her back to her condo. I was flooded with conflicting emotions. As our family Napoleon, my mother always forced her way. Now she was destroying her health to compel us to take her home. Seeing her in this fragile state, I wanted to give in. But I'd have to close the small business my husband and I had built over 14 years and move home. I'd have to check on her every half hour to ensure she didn't fall. I'd have to bathe her, force feed her food and meds, and absorb her ire. A better person would make this sacrifice. 3 weeks later, we visited to celebrate my mother's 89th birthday. We ate cake at a courtyard table beside a classic convertible. She complained that everyone there was crazy, so we changed topics, another strategy for dealing with dementia patients. My husband mentioned our wedding. "You got married?" she said. "Congratulations, I am so happy for you." I wanted to correct her, reminding her that she'd walked me down the aisle 14 years prior. Instead, I stroked her hand. My eyes got wet. Wrong and right were one and the same. This next chapter of her life would be painful. My only hope was that she'd become enveloped in a pleasant memory. My mother's face lit up and she laughed. She kissed me and held my husband's bearded face in her hands. "You married such a nice man." "I did," I said. As I hugged my mother goodbye, I wish we could live in this moment forever.
Thank you. Not asking for a show of hands, but how many of us have had to deal with that really close to home, right? It's just one of the reasons I picked this, right? Yeah, one of the reasons I picked this is it's not breaking news, but it's the day in, day out of so many people I interact with. And I don't know if the point of this piece is really to remain on that focus, which is how do we manage the care of someone we love, even if it means lying, the therapeutic lying, the way the article introduces itself and later on kind of suggests that's on the author's mind, at least initially, but it's so much more. I just wanted to make some space for us to kind of acknowledge that and offer offer an opportunity for any kind of feedback or response that you might have. Any response to that piece that you would share with us? Yeah, oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm still in thought. Thank you. Thanks, Mary Jo.
Having gone through something very easily with Channing's mother, it was a delight. She asked to go to assisted living, and then we came upon my mother's experience, and it was excruciating. And she was angry with me for the rest of her life, unfortunately. And as I think about that, and we get older, I begin to wonder, how am I, when and if probably more likely when this happens to me. Am I going to be graceful or am I going to be angry? I think it's a question many of us ask ourselves at this stage.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Other reflections or responses?
I don't think people going through this really realize they're going through it. I don't think that's why, one reason I think they get angry. They don't want to face that, and they don't believe it. I just recently went through this with my mother, and so I'm pretty used to that thinking.
Yeah.
They get angry because they don't agree.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Those we care for often don't recognize what's really happening. And that the people, what's so profound for me in this reading is how clearly the daughter wants anything for her mother, anything and everything for her mother, considering incredible sacrifice just to make her mother happy. And yet that real wrestle, that struggle with what's best. Yeah. Other reflections? Tiffany.
My grandmother passed away Wednesday night. She's been quite ill for several years. She was diagnosed with diabetes right before I was born. And at that time, 45 years ago, there weren't a whole lot of positive things that doctors could tell diabetics. So in the later years, she became to where she couldn't see anymore. She gave up her home. She moved to Fayetteville. She lived on the university bus route so she could still get around and get to Mass at St. Thomas and get to the places she needed to be. But in the last few months, she had to have her leg amputated, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for her. She just kind of started giving up. You know, my grandmother, who was a very social woman, who was kind of the adopted grandmother and great-grandmother at St. Thomas at the Sunday Mass for the college kids, stopped going to Mass, stopped socializing, and then finally, about a month ago, I get a phone call from my father late on a Saturday night saying, I need you to come over. You know, she's very ill. And I got there, and I managed to talk him into sending her to the hospital. And I finally was able to convince him she needed to go to long-term care, for which she was very angry. Last week, I got a phone call saying she won't get out of her room. She won't go to the dining room. She won't socialize. You know, this is my grandmother, who's 88 and a half years old, who was everybody's grandmother. And Wednesday night, I get a phone call from my dad saying, it's urgent. I need you to get to the nursing home. I said, I'm on my way. And I missed her by 10 minutes. But she finally made peace. She got up. She went to the dining room for dinner. She socialized that afternoon. And the nurse who took care of her was someone that I had worked with a long time ago at City Hospital and was with her when she took her last breath. So a lot of anger, but I think she finally made peace with it. I know my family is really struggling. I made peace with it. I wrote her obituary. That's what helped me. So.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. It seems that from the outside, it seems that those who are experiencing this kind of transition, dementia, often find themselves alone or isolated, but I think that's true also of the people who are caring for them. I spend as much time caring for the caregivers as I do for the individuals who are in at least the clearest need, the most obvious need. And the one thing I find myself saying over and over and over and over again is if you don't care for yourself, then you will end up in the hospital, and then I'll be stuck with your mother, and I don't want to be responsible for caring for your mother, your husband, your mother. Right? And I say that joke, I say it with a laugh, just as you bring out as well, because the duty that we feel we have to shoulder that, and the conflicting emotions and the conflicting values are really difficult to sort through, and I find an absence of, at least informal ways, of relationships and groups that support caregivers and loved ones in that way. There's some informal groups, friendships, other family members that sometimes are present, but often there's an absence, or at least there appears from where I've experienced it, an absence of care. I kind of just want to make some space today to kind of acknowledge that. Other responses to the piece? Yes, Rhonda.
We experienced this with my father, but I think that guilt is an interesting driver of caregivers, because I think that at some point you do have to make a decision for yourself, or even with my mother, when we were trying to say, at some point you have to do what's best for you, but you're many times talking about someone who has sacrificed their whole life for you. And so it's such a difficult decision, and I think there's so much anxiety that comes with that for everyone. So I think that it's kind of a cyclical.
Yeah, absolutely. That guilt is profound, and the article even mentions, right, the, am I really doing this to the person who spoon-fed me chicken soup when I was sick, right? I mean, it's a profound collision there. Well, thank you all. I want to say we've got several opportunities at St. Paul's to care for individuals who either suffer from dementia, but primarily to those who help them. Our Thursday afternoon respite care group called Caring Friends meets here Thursday mornings, from 9 in the morning until 2, a lunch and a program every Thursday. An important opportunity for us to care for those suffering from dementia so that caregivers can go to the grocery store, take a nap, get their hair done, go to the doctor, do all the things that often can't be done. Also, there's the Saging group, which is a group of those who are entering that sort of that last chapter of life, maybe not last chapter, but last few chapters of life. And that's a group that meets twice a week just to support one another in wherever they are in their walk of life. A great group that meets to explore not only issues about end-of-life issues, but also just the pursuit of knowledge and experience and wisdom. So I raise that group to you. Also, of course, your clergy are people who would love to join you in praying for any of those circumstances that are burdens for you. Let me pass out for y'all a second article, which comes from a publication that I always hold at a bit of a distance. It's called The Living Church. Sometimes it's satirized as the Livid Church, because everybody who writes for The Living Church seems to be angry about something. And usually it's about the progressive things that I want to celebrate in our church. But this piece, which is written by an acquaintance of mine, really caught my attention. And I thought it might be good for us to read it. I need, again, 2 volunteers. Does everybody have one, or can everybody see one? Thank you. Thank you. I've got 2 more, 3 more that I might give away. Anybody else need one? Do y'all? Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'd quietly lay them here without mentioning to you what they were. What else? Anybody else need one? All right, I need 2 volunteers again, please. Would somebody read the first and half of the second page? Let's go through the first sort of 3 partial paragraphs, right? So stopping after former president. Who might read that for us, pretty please? Thank you, Jim. And who would read after former president, picking up with of course, and read the rest of the article? Who would read that for us, pretty please? Oh, someone will, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Elena. Here we go. Go ahead, Jim.
I was not even 2 years old when George H.W. Bush was inaugurated as the 41st President of the United States. I am not as familiar with his presidency, the deeds and misdeeds of his administration, and even the scrutiny of his personal life that inevitably arose amid the indignity that is public life in our nation. The only real memory I have of his presidency is less mine than a story my family told me repeatedly through the years about the childhood naivete that escaped my young lips on the eve of the Gulf War. There was a boy my brother's age, the next block over, whose family had emigrated from Iraq. Not really comprehending the difference between war and a football game, I once lightheartedly asked, "So, if the U.S. and Iraq go to war, who are you going to root for?" I assure you, the story also includes that my 3-year-old faux pas was handled with immaculate grace and charity by my brother's friend. I tell you this simply to disqualify myself as one who can speak knowledgeably about his presidency. I can, however, speak knowledgeably as a Christian and a priest in the Episcopal Church, President Bush's lifelong home, about the realities of death and what our faith has to say about it and what we do when it happens. When I opened the Facebook app on my phone on December 1st and saw the news that our former president had died, I stopped and did what I thought any reasonable Christian ought to do. I prayed. With the words from the commendation prayer and our burial rite firmly in my heart, after burying more people than I care to count, I prayed that God with mercy upon a fellow sinner who had breathed his last. I prayed that George H.W. Bush would rest in peace and rise in glory. As has become rather commonplace in response to the death of a person of note in our society, I posted this prayer in brief on Facebook and went about my day in preparation for a wedding that evening. What I saw when I later returned to Facebook didn't shock me because I've seen it before, but it did turn my stomach. Public expressions of outrage by Christians, including clergy, who were trashing a man on the day of his death. I was disgusted. It was distressing to think to myself, this is the leadership of our church. So to my fellow priests who have seen fit to dehumanize, even demonize Mr. Bush on the day of his death and his funeral, I say this: a man is dead. Be a Christian. And what's more, a priest. Pray for God's mercy and the repose of the dead. Pretend for a moment that you actually believe in repentance and reconciliation, and that you are a sinner in need of and saved by God's redeeming love. Pray for those who mourn. I will also pray that when we die, other people will show more grace toward us in their words than I have witnessed from you about our former president.
Of course, I did share these words on Facebook in the heat of the moment. In response, I was told that if I had lost friends or family to AIDS because of the president's actions and negligence, perhaps I would have more compassion for those who cannot tolerate the veneration of a man thought to be the cause of their suffering. It was interesting that a call to pray for the dead was likened to veneration. I was told I should understand the anger that people have because it was World AIDS Day on which President Bush was being eulogized, as if he timed his demise with some sort of malicious intent. I would remind my brother and sister, priests, that our role, first and foremost, is to pray and to call God's people to prayer. Clergy are to be an example of grace, not vengeance, wrath, or condemnation. St. Paul admonishes presbyters, pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Continue in these things, for in doing this you will save both yourself and your hearers. Vitriolic public comment from clergy about the dead, online or offline, is indefensible. It is entirely possible that you consider George H.W. Bush a sinner. Truthfully, he was just as much a sinner in need of a Savior as you and I are. In fact, the degree to which you think he deserves judgment, wrath, or condemnation for those things that he had done or left undone should directly affect the fervor for which you, as a Christian and a cleric, should be praying for God's mercy upon him. To believe otherwise is bad enough. To speak otherwise from your position of authority is to risk imperiling your audience. Those who look to us for spiritual guidance may start to ask themselves, if priests say such things about this person, what might they say about me and my sinfulness? Or, if this is what clergy do, what will God do to me because of my sin? Can anyone really be saved? Ministers of the gospel have the critical task of proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ to sinners who need to know that their Redeemer lives and intercedes for them. I urge you, do not abandon this monumental responsibility to satisfy whatever unedifying itch you may scratch. When I die, I hope that people remember I am a sinner saved by grace alone and pray for me, not shame me in death for the sins of my past. I am disturbed that any Christian, lay or ordained, would demonize a newly departed Christian soul. All that I can do in response to the death of President Bush is pray for a fellow sinner who has been washed in the blood of our crucified and risen Lord and Savior. Into your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend your servant George Herbert Walker Bush. Acknowledge, we humbly beseech you, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light. Amen.
Thank you both very much. I've only given you one half of the story, of course. There was a little bit of reference in the article to some of the reasons that individuals were critical of President George H.W. Bush upon the occasion of his death. We could have read some of the other posts or some of the things that sort of inspired this article, but I've just given you that, so I want to acknowledge to start that I haven't told the whole story. But how would you respond to this article, to what we've read, or to your own experience of President Bush's death and funeral and the comments that we've seen both within the church and also within the secular world about his legacy and about the act of commending him to God at the time of his death? What are your responses to that? May I borrow that? Thank you.
Well, it's kind of interesting that the writer, seems like me and the writer are at a very similar age. I was born in the 90s. I don't really know anything about what happened in the first Gulf War, but it seems like, in general, people of my age are very polarized on everything. Either you're for or against, and in that act, we put people on a pedestal rather than just treating them as people. I think the writer had a very good point. You know, person died, we should at least show dignity. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Other comments, feedback? Jim, coming back to you.
It reminded me of the other article, in that when we see someone who's in trouble and who is deteriorating mentally and going wherever it is that they go, that's us. And when we die, that's us. And I have a friend who was lionizing George Herbert Walker book, and I was not Bush, and I was not quite so enthusiastic, but I recognize that when we go because we're all going to do that. Mm-hmm. We're all going to do that. I know too that there are some whose theology is such that we don't need really to pray for the dead. If they're believers, they're going to paradise. They're going to glory. But as a wise priest of mine said a couple of weekends ago, we pray for the dead because we love them. And it's tough it was tough for me to love that man and the havoc that came from him and his supporters and the heartache and the misery. But what else are you going to do when people die? And that's, when all are welcome at our table, whoever you are and wherever you are in your journey of faith, you are welcome here. You are welcome at God's table. Everybody, it seems to me, means everybody. And I've shared that with a couple of people, and they say, yeah, it's hard. It's hard, but they didn't say, yeah, it's hard, so don't do it. They said, yeah, it's hard. So something about letting go and accepting and turning one's life over to Jesus and turning one's life over to God to be able to do the things that we'll do for people, because that's going to be us someday.
Thank you. Other comments?
I was just going to say, listening to the funeral service, Alan Simpson got up and mainly told anecdotes about the person. And that person was very different than the CIA director or the president. And that's something we lose sight of is with people in public life, is that they can simultaneously be an incredible person, a great Christian, and a very, very not very good at their job, whatever that may be. So just want to throw that in.
Thank you. It caught me by surprise. I saw several colleagues pointed to a particularly malicious-seeming post about George H.W. Bush, and that he is now, she supposed, with all the other victims of the AIDS epidemic whom he failed to respond to appropriately as president, with all the people who died, the innocent lives who were killed in the first Persian Gulf War. And she sort of went on, and I saw it, and it really caught me up short for the same reasons that Paul writes in this article. But I found myself wondering, all right, when do we take a moment and reflect critically? And I don't mean sort of with true animosity, but in that true critical spirit that we hold our leaders, any public figure, certainly a presidential figure, but also other political and economic and even religious figures. At what point are we able to have a conversation about Bush's failures as a president, or any leader's failures as a leader, and not demonize or even dehumanize them at the moment of their death? And to use a kind of crass analogy, how cold must the body be before we are able to ask those questions? And I saw as the days unfolded, some other, in the New York Times, in other sort of newspapers, The Guardian, they were sort of, after a couple of days, they felt like they could say that. But I'm curious, what's your experience of that? How do we have a discourse, a critical discourse about a former leader, and yet still sort of pay the human respect that any human being would deserve? How do we balance that? Or any other response that you might have to the article?
I don't know that it's so much as to when as maybe how you do it and how you approach it. It reminded me, I believe I was around third grade when Reagan got shot, and I was in elementary school, and we all watched it on TV. Every teacher rolled in a TV, and we all watched it, and you didn't hear anything except for sadness and fear at that time. But I recall my mom, like when Reagan became president, I remember her saying, but he took away children's milks. Like every kid used to get milk in school. And that was something that my mother was very bothered by, very upset about, did not believe in. But at the time when he was shot, everyone just respectfully was sad by that and admired that at that time. To me, it was kind of the same for George Bush. I mean, I watched as much as I could and didn't really think of all of the policies because at that moment. But I think it is good to have a conversation about it.
Thank you. One of the gifts that Bishop Keith Sloan of Alabama gave me is he always preached these incredible funeral sermons. And I asked him, what's the gift there? What's the trick there? And he said, make them laugh, let them cry, give them hope. Which is a great, really helpful bit. But what he didn't elaborate on, but what I heard in his speaking, is that he was not afraid to name what it was about the decedent that burdened us, that challenged us. When he buried an alcoholic, he wasn't afraid to name that struggle in that person's life and also in our life. And I wonder if there's a way in which we can acknowledge that an individual is a sinner, to use the language of the article and also the language of our faith, to acknowledge that someone's a sinner, but in a way that offers hope and redemption beyond that person. How many people watched at least part of one of the myriad of services or funerals? Yes, I did too. Anything, they were all Episcopal funerals, right? If you saw the service in the National Cathedral, you saw Michael, the presiding bishop, Marion Buddy, the Bishop of Washington. Also, what's his face from St. Martin's, Russ Levinson from St. Martin's in Houston, his Bush's actual priest, pastor. What if you saw the service at St. Martin's as well, a similar service? What about the services did you notice? What are some of the details that caught your eye or your ear as we shared in those?
I thought it was a beautiful ceremony, and I was so proud to be an Episcopalian. The music was beautiful. It just, I cried during the service, and he was just a person, like we are. And like Gary said, he had a job maybe that he didn't do very well at.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. I love the fact that you remind us that he's a person, which is to say he was buried the way we bury anybody. I mean, we might not have two bishops and the rector of the biggest Episcopal church in the country at our funeral, and they might not show it on CNN, but the language is the same. We might not have 4 eulogies, but the language is the same. The hymns were the same. I've been to services at St. Paul's in my short time here, where some of those hymns are hymns that we've sung. The beautiful liturgy. I was proud to be an Episcopalian that day too. Absolutely. What else do you notice? What else did you notice about the services, or comments on the article? What else did you notice, or what else would you share in this moment of kind of grieving and transition as we have this conversation about a former president? What do you notice, Bess?
I've lived in Fayetteville since 1935, so I have memories about different funerals, and my recollection is that many years ago there was a funeral service at a local church where the rector absolutely went after the deceased, all his problems and so on. And this caused a division of the church where half the congregation went west to develop a new church. It was just that I didn't hear the service, but and I couldn't have been very old at the time, but it did interest me that I would remember that there's you don't have to deify the deceased, but for the clergy, they need to be careful not to jump on them.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and there's a delicacy there. There's it's one of those memes on Facebook that clergy people share. And there's somebody walking in the office, and the parish parish administrator or whoever fills that role is asked, is the rector in? And yes, but he's busy. He's planning the funeral of one of his least favorite parishioners. And the response is, oh, did someone die? She said, no, but it makes him feel better to practice. right. But, but you're right. What does it mean for us to acknowledge in sympathy? And God sees us as we are. As I've heard said at the Episcopal service, we're great because we bury princes and paupers the same way, right? There's a reason we cover the casket with a pall. Because if you've got a really fancy casket or a cheap cardboard box, in the eyes of God, you're the same. And so part of our hope is to proclaim, whether you struggled with recovery, whether you swindled your employees, whether you were turned your back on the AIDS epidemic in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, whatever it is, God still sees you as you are and loves you as you are. That's got to be the message. And if we want to pretend that somebody's perfect, we deny the real value of the hope that we get. But you're absolutely right. We can't jump on somebody, and we have to check that. We have to hold that up, or else, as I think the author of this article rightly says, what's this really about? Right? It's about us. Jim said it too. Right? It's our anger that's showing up, not the failures of the individual in the casket. Yeah. Time for maybe one or two more observations. Do you have the microphone? Yeah. Thanks.
One thing I think is that we have to remember that we're not the judges, and that's both for the dead and for the living. And so I think that it's okay to let people be angry. So we don't have to say anything. It's not our job to, tell other people that they shouldn't be behaving in any certain way. And I think it is important, and I think that what those people who are angry and who are posting things and writing things about the faults of President Bush, I think that they're serving an important role in making sure that we remember the wrongs, we remember the people, we remember the lives that were lost. And I think that they're serving an important role, and that's not the role maybe that we want to play, and that's not our position. But our position also is not to judge them.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. And in some back and forth, because posts like the one that inspired this article get a lot of attention from clergy colleagues, and the response was, to someone in that position, a lot is expected of somebody like that. So we can ask questions about President Bush in a way that we can't ask about Aunt Betty. So it's a different vehicle. But part of the question that you invite is, all right, so whose role is that? And what does it mean for a clergy person to have that role? What about clergy person as prophet, whose job it is to hold the feet of the king to the fire and say, this is not God's will, this is not justice? Or the person whose job it is to bury the king. I mean, it depends. And sometimes those roles get confused, and I appreciate the invitation to remember that we're not judge, but we can have that conversation without being judged. There's a space there somewhere. Yeah, thank you. One other response? Yeah, Mary Jo.
I just wanted to say that there was something to be said, and the symbolism of the simple exchange of a piece of candy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, the President Bush's funeral provided lots of opportunity for theological reflection for me. There's the piece of candy. There's this sort of conversation here. Also, saw several people responding about whether President Trump said the Apostles' Creed or didn't say the Creed. Why didn't he say the prayer? What does that mean? Do evangelicals say the Creed? And it's this great sort of conversation about what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be an observant Christian? What's really going on? And also all of our sort of the latent sort of anger and hostility and frustration sort of comes out in moments like that, doesn't it? Absolutely. I also wonder if part of the post that inspired this article has less to do with Bush and more to do with the current political climate, right? Just this kind of this sense of impotence. That justice has been made impotent in this chapter, in the idea of those who might post it. A real struggle, but the fact that two things I want to say, and then we'll finish. One, the fact that we're sort of firing shots at each other, even within the Episcopal Church, right? These are all Episcopalians and Episcopal clergy, right, who are firing shots at each other about appropriate and inappropriate ways to be critical of a president during a time of mourning. Says something about the escalated tension and anger and frustration that just sort of fills our space. I also celebrate that I'm a part of a church where we can talk about it, where we can read an article like this, and I don't have, I'll invite them, but I don't expect I'll have 30 emails waiting in my inbox when I'm done about how dare you do this. I have served in churches where you can't have a conversation like this. I love the fact that this is a safe place for us to acknowledge that we don't all agree. We are not all of one mind, but there's a truth, capital T, that we're called to pursue regardless of whether we agree with one another, and we can agree on that truth. So I celebrate the fact that we can have conversations like this. Next week, the Reader Theater will be here, and the week after as well. I printed out a third article about a nun who tweets a prayer to President Trump every day. On my way out, I'll leave them on that little blue table in the corner because they're just going to go in the recycling bin. It's complicated, of course, otherwise I wouldn't have picked it. So I invite you, if you choose to pick one and to read it, and I hope to see y'all back next week for Reader Theater. Thank y'all.